What's up, everybody? Don Model here, and welcome to Codecast Live. Today, we're going to be talking about events. Basically, if a user clicks on something on your web page, or even other kinds of events, could probably be more complex, of course. But we're just going to be dealing with user events here. When that actually occurs, just like doing something after an event happens. So, like. We'll be working with just a click event today, but there's lots of other different events that you could listen to based off of user input. We talked about some form inputs last week if you want to look at that video to get some ideas, some other types of inputs that user can handle. But we're just going to be talking about the button today. So we're going to go to the code pen. The link is on the bottom of the video. But for today, we're just going to be working with some regular buttons. So in order to make a button element, we'll just use the button element thing like this. And we're going to call this red. And we're going to actually put a value in here, and the value is going to be red. Okay? Make another button, a bouton. And similarly, we're going to call this guy green and put a value of green. And then last one, very similar. I'm just going to call this one blue. Okay, so now you can see that we made 3 buttons here. We'll do a little save. There we go. We have 3 buttons here. We have a red, a green, and a blue. Okay. Now these don't represent the buttons themselves aren't red, green, and blue. But what we're going to do is when you press the button, it's going to change the background to one of these colors. All right. Now, we're just going to use JavaScript for this, but you could also do some CSS in here. But we will actually be changing the CSS of the page when we click the buttons. Now, we talked about also selecting different elements, and one of the ways we could select different elements is using document query selector. Now, let's do a little bit of a refresher from that. We're going to say buttons, and we can say document query selector all, which is going to get all of my buttons. Just like that. Okay, so it's the button element, and I'm getting all of them. And that's going to be a node list. It's very similar to an array, but it's not exactly an array. So if we wanted to listen for each button individually, we would do something like buttons and then 0, which would be this first button here. And then we would be able to kind of get the button's properties and stuff like that. So for instance, let me open up my console here. If I want to know that button's value, right here, I'll just make that a little smaller so we can see the lines here. Let's open my console. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to just cut this out for a moment just so we could see. Where's my cut? There it is. Console log. That button's value. And we should see red in here. There it is, red. Okay, so that's giving me the first button, right? Because button index 0 is the first in an array or a node list in our case, and the properties of value is going to return the red part here. Okay, it just so happens that the attribute and this property match up. Now, if I wanted to get the second one, it would just be incrementing this at 1. We can get green, and then the last one blue. And then if I try to do another one after that, it should error out, saying that it can't get a property of undefined because this doesn't exist. Okay. So now one of the things that we could do is we could add an event listener to any one of those. So we can say buttons 0 and then add event listener. And then we could say, actually, before we put anything in here, add event listener is a method, and it takes 2 arguments. And you can see us erroring out over here saying that it's looking for 2 arguments and I have nothing in there. So the first argument is a string, and it represents the event that we're expecting, which is a click. And then the second argument is an actual function. And the function is the thing that we're expecting to run when we actually click the button. Okay? So what I recommend is when you put a function in as a argument, if it's just an anonymous function, meaning that it doesn't have a name, it's really important for you to write the entire function with like the braces and stuff like that inside before you start writing any of the functions, like very specific stuff. And what I mean by that is writing the word function, the parentheses, and then the squiggly braces. Right? This represents a function. Okay, this is the same way that we would write a function if it was outside. It's just a parameter that's inside of here. All right. Now that we've written the entire function, we could start filling it in with stuff. So when we actually call this function, it actually passes in a argument in here called the event argument. Okay. So we'll name it like this. Sometimes you'll see it named like this, and sometimes it'll just be E. I personally like to name it EV when I'm doing it in like production and stuff. But for the cases of us playing around right now, I'll just name this as event so you could see what's happening. So this will automatically pass in this argument in here, which has an object that represents all the information about the event that just occurred. And we can see that when we do a console log of that event. All right. So now what should happen, once I get my page back here, let me do a refresh. Try this maybe. There it goes. Okay. So now if I click this button red, which is again the first button in my list, I should get this right here. Okay. This is the object that it represents event. You can see it's a mouse event, right? There's a whole bunch of different properties on here. And you can see the type is click, which is basically matching up with what I have here. There's a whole bunch of other different stuff. You can see if the Alt key was pressed, the client X and layer X and page and offset X, Y movement, all that stuff is related to where the mouse was in relation to where the click happened or on the page. You can also see the target here, okay, which is actually pretty important. We're going to get to that in a minute, but it's the button. You can actually see the button itself in here. So that's basically the same thing as button 0. If I said event.target, it's going to give me the same node or the same object. So you can see that in there, which is really nice. So now what we could do with this is we can actually change the background color of the page. Now an easy way of us selecting the background is actually just going and saying document body, and then we could say style, which is on the property. And then we can say background color. And remember when I said that the value is on the node or the element itself? We can get the element by saying event target and then the value, right? We just did that before. So the event target is the node, right? We got that from down here. There's a button right there. And then we saw the values of each one, so that's just dot value. So that's going to represent, in this particular case, is going to say red. Okay, so now what should happen is if I click this button here, red. Okay, so that's setting the color of red on the document's body directly. And you can see that here. Let me just open this up a little bit. See, it says the background color has been set to red. That's us doing that with JavaScript right here. Okay, now what we could do is we could have for each individual button, we can go ahead and say buttons 0, buttons 1, buttons 2, and I'll have the a similar function. We could also, of course, write this function outside. So let's say we'll say like this function change color, and then again it takes an event. We can just put all this stuff right in here, just like this. And now because this represents a function, I could replace this with this entire function, right? So this function here represents this function, and it should work exactly the same. Let's click the button. Nice. Okay. So now that means that what we could do is we could again copy this whole thing and make two versions of it, two additional versions of it that just target the other buttons, right? And because this event is specific to the button that was pressed, that means if I click the green button, I should get green, the blue should get blue, and again the red keeps getting the red. Okay, now that's one way of doing it, but what happens if I have like lots of different buttons, a lot of different places? I don't want to have to, find out which ones are which. You could go like make a for loop and go through each one, but I'm going to show you a different version, and that's using event bubbling. Basically what we're going to be doing is actually listening for all click events on the page and determining if that click event is something that we actually care about. All right, so in this particular case, instead of having all the buttons here, we're actually, you know what? No, we're going to get rid of the buttons. Let's get rid of the buttons. And we're going to say document, body, add, event listener, click. And then in here, all right, we're going to actually check to see if the event is an event that we want. Meaning that we're going to check the object that goes in here, see if the thing that was clicked is something that could be useful to us, and then actually fire the function here. Okay, so we're going to do a little check here. We're going to say if event target value, okay, which is just checking if there's a value on the event target. Then we're going to fire that function. Oops. Okay. So that means if I click here, it's not going to do anything. It's just going to start selecting these buttons, but that doesn't matter anything much, right? But if I click this, it works. Okay, and again, I don't know the buttons that are on here directly. I'm just going to go ahead and like assume that the thing's going to have a value on it. And if it has a value, then I change the color. Okay. Now, similarly, I could also pull this and put this in here because I'm using the event in here, right? I could say, you know, this whole check I can do in here instead. Right? If it has an event target value, then do the thing. And then we're right kind of back where we started again with just sending in the event right here. So again, remember the event listener has two parameters. It's going to be the click and then the actual function. And I'm sorry I used the arrow function in there. I'm getting used to that. If you guys are confused about what that is, it's okay. We'll talk about that at some other point. But again, this is just a regular function in here. And I'm passing in the function is event target value is basically looking at the node that was clicked or the element that was clicked and seeing if it has a value. Because if it doesn't have a value, right, like the body right now doesn't have a value on it, and you can see that if I inspect, HTML doesn't have a value, body doesn't have a value. So that means that this thing, if I click the body, it doesn't do anything, okay? But if it does have a value, which is the only stuff on those pages that has a value is the red, green, and blue buttons, then it actually will fire, or not really fire, but more so take the event target value and apply it to the document body background color. So that's how you're able to like basically propagate events on the page pretty simply without worrying about like what's actually clicking on the page. Again, I kind of apologize for the arrow that was in there. I know I didn't talk about that yet. It's another way of writing a function that has to do with scoping. We're going to get to that at some point in the future, but if you look at arrow functions, there's another, you know, kind of method in terms of writing a function that's out there. But for right now, if you just write, you know, function with a name and then, you know, pass it in, it's usually a lot easier than trying to write the function inside of the event target, the parameters in there for the event listener. Like I said, there's a lot of other events you could listen to. You could listen for changing, you know, in a drop down. You could listen for the input or keyboard events for inputs. What else could you listen to? You could listen to the mouse moving, if the mouse moves in somewhere or some element that moves. So there's a lot of different things you could listen to figure out what the user is doing at a particular time. And there's even more complex ways of listening for events that like other elements could trigger events that other elements could listen to. So like when an element changes, you could actually fire your own custom event that could be listened to for other elements on the page, and they could do their own work based on that change, which is really cool too. But that's it. If you have any questions about anything else, leave a comment down below. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next week. Later.